To him, she was just a wager. To her, he was just another polished lie in a world full of broken promises. But when two damaged hearts collided, what followed was not a fairy tale. It was war, dressed as a contract. But no one could have predicted what would unfold when two wounded souls collided. Not in a fairy tale, but in a contract that was never meant to involve feelings. That night, the San Francisco sky hung heavy with mist. The city lights flickered against the glass facade of Rowe Tower. At the very top floor, where the wind howled and the world below felt insignificant, Ethan Rowe, CEO of a billion-dollar tech empire, stood alone, holding a glass of untouched whiskey. His gray suit fit him flawlessly, as if every inch of his life had been tailored. Precise, distant, without a single crease. But his eyes, they told another story. A silent storm swirled within them, the gaze of a man who once believed in love and lost it to betrayal. Ethan had loved deeply enough to believe that love could be home. But it shattered. Since that day, he ran his company like a battlefield and trained himself to treat emotions as enemies to be kept on a tight leash. Until she arrived. Aria Sullivan, the rebellious girl, known more for her scandals than her art. Her name lit up gossip columns like wildfire. They were never meant to meet, and certainly never meant to touch. But fate doesn't ask for permission. It only needs a moment. And that moment had just begun. The tech industry's fundraising gala at Sterling Hall was the kind of event where power walked in Gucci and Prada, where deals were sealed over wine older than some of the interns. Beneath the warm golden lights and polite laughter, Ethan Rowe walked in like an unspoken king. All eyes turned. CEO of Rowe, dubbed the man rewiring the digital world by Time. But his gaze didn't linger on handshakes or rehearsed compliments. He moved like a machine, on time, on track, on roll. One man noticed, the only one who dared to tease him, Derek Wu, longtime friend and financial partner, always knew how to poke through Ethan's perfectly tailored armor. "You need to loosen up," Derek said as they leaned against the bar. "You look like you're here for a memorial, not a party." "I'm here for the PR, not the flirting," Ethan replied coolly. "Perfect timing then," Derek smirked. "Because? I've got a game for you." Ethan arched a brow. "I don't do games, Derek. This one's profitable. You see her?" Derek nodded toward a far corner of the room. Ethan turned, and that was the first time he saw her. Aria Sullivan perched like defiance itself on a velvet sofa, champagne in hand, laughing like the world couldn't touch her. She looked like a dare wrapped in silk, a storm in red lipstick. Messy bun, red dress that broke every rule, eyes too sharp to be careless. She was chaos wrapped in silk. "Who is she?" Ethan asked. "Aria Sullivan, daughter of the late filmmaker Marcus Sullivan. After he passed, her stepmother Victoria took over everything. Now she's forcing Aria to marry some washed-up senator to preserve family honor. But Aria, she's fire, not glass. And what does that have to do with me?" Derek's smirk deepened. "I bet you can't turn her into the Rowe ideal. In 3 months, a poised, elegant partner, publicly married, controlled, refined, you built an empire. Can you transform a wild card?" Ethan chuckled. "She's not a business model. 2 million, I bet. If she agrees to marry you, for 3 months, public appearances, clean image, you win. If not, I take my equity back." Ethan weighed it. It wasn't about the money. It was the woman. There was something behind those eyes, wild but wounded. And if she agrees, the game's on. The invitation went out. A private lunch at Rowe Tower's sky-high restaurant. Aria showed up in a tight black dress, messy bun, and the walk of someone who didn't care what the world thought. "So the tech king wants to tame me?" she said, legs crossed, eyes daring. "Not tame," Ethan replied. "Just a mutually beneficial contract. 3 months of a public marriage. No emotion, no intimacy. I need a partner for appearances. You need freedom from Victoria. We both win." She stared at him like he might be joking or insane. "And after 3 months, we separate. No scandal, no strings." She laughed, a bitter sound. "You're worse than they say, but at least you're honest." Then she extended her hand. "Deal, but one rule. Stay out of my room. No seduction, no empty promises." "I never make promises," Ethan said, and shook her hand. 3 weeks later, the wedding took place. Lavish, loud, and headline-worthy. The city buzzed about the most unexpected couple of the year. But no one knew that behind the cameras and contracts, a real story was quietly waiting to unfold. And just like that, they became husband and wife. On paper, not in heart. There was no honeymoon, no kiss for the cameras, just a silent ride in a black limousine and 2 people walking into a mansion as if each were entering their own private prison. Rowe Estate, nestled outside San Francisco, wasn't a home. It was a monument to power. Neoclassical in structure, with high ceilings, long, endless corridors, and cold light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything was immaculate. Everything lacked warmth. Aria stepped in, still in her wedding gown, heels in hand, hair tousled by the wind. Ethan didn't look at her, only said, "Your room is in the south wing. It's ready." "Thanks," she replied, her tone flat and distant. The first morning, they sat across a massive oak table for breakfast, the distance between them a symbol of everything unspoken. Aria nibbled on fruit. Ethan read the finance section like she wasn't there. "You still don't trust I'll honor the agreement, do you?" she asked. Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't trust what hasn't been proven." "Good," she said, pushing back her chair, leaving her orange juice untouched. That day, Aria wandered the mansion like a ghost. Portraits in gilded frames lined the halls, staring back at her. The staff were polite but distant, trained for precision, not warmth. That evening, she stumbled upon a garden behind a narrow side corridor. Wild grass peeked between stone paths, and lavender bloomed quietly in forgotten corners, as if someone once loved this place but had long since left. From that day on, she returned every afternoon. She brought a notebook, sometimes a book, sometimes nothing. She simply sat, listening to the breeze. There she could breathe, not be seen, not be judged. What Ethan didn't know, or chose not to see, was that Aria had begun to change. Not for him, for herself. She learned every staff member's name, remembered their birthdays. One day, learning the chef's son had a heart condition, she quietly paid the medical bills through Ethan's financial office. No one knew it was her. She visited a foster home once cared for by her childhood nanny, leaving a large anonymous donation. No photos, no publicity. Aria was no longer the tabloid scandal, but Ethan hadn't noticed yet. He came home late, dined alone, buried himself in meetings and deadlines. He avoided her gaze. And she, strangely, no longer felt hurt by that. Until one evening, while she poured tea in the kitchen, a quiet voice said behind her, "You spend a lot of time in the garden." She turned slowly, ceramic cup in hand. "It's the only place in this house that breathes." Ethan didn't smile, but for once, he didn't walk away. "I thought you'd be bored," he said. "And I thought you'd ignore me forever," she replied. Half serious, half teasing. Silence. She met his eyes. "I'm not who the media says I am." "I know," he said gently, "and I've stopped trying to fit you into a mold." That night, they had dinner together. No phones, no papers, no expectations. Just a simple soup, soft music from hidden speakers, and 2 people, for the first time, letting their armor rest. Later, standing before her mirror, Aria whispered, for the first time in years, "Maybe I'm still someone worth being seen." A week after that first dinner, nothing outwardly changed. Ethan still spent most of his time behind closed doors. Aria still escaped to the garden every afternoon, as if it were her own secret sanctuary. But something was beginning to shift. It wasn't dramatic. not loud, but it was there. It was in the way he looked at her. Ethan started to watch her longer when she passed by, not with judgment, not with analysis like before, but with something quieter, curiosity even, sincerity, as if for the first time he was trying to see her, not the headlines. Aria noticed, but she didn't say anything. She let it happen. One afternoon, when a light rain drizzled over the city, she sat beneath a tree in the garden, shielding her head with a worn book. That's when Ethan appeared. Unannounced. No umbrella, just a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled, hair damp from the rain. "You'll catch a cold sitting out here," he said, standing a few feet away. "And you?" she shot back playfully. He hesitated, then stepped closer, sitting beside her on the stone bench without another word. The rain tapped gently on leaves and stone. The world quieted, leaving just two people, and a softness between them that hadn't been there before. "When I was little," Aria began, "my dad kept a small garden. He planted sunflowers. Every morning he'd tell me, 'Grow like the flowers. Always lift your head, rain or shine.'" Ethan didn't reply, but he listened. "I lost that garden when he died. My stepmother tore it up to build a garage. Since then, I've never planted anything again." There was a pause. "My father was a lawyer," Ethan said at last. "Strict. He taught me that feelings make people fail. I believed him for far too long." Aria turned to look at him. For the first time, she didn't see the cold tycoon. Just a man. Still learning how to feel. "Maybe," she said gently, "feelings don't make us weak. Maybe they make us human." They didn't touch, there was no romantic gesture, but from that moment on, something inside both of them began to crack open. That night, Ethan didn't eat alone in his office. He came downstairs, sat across from Aria. He didn't talk much, but when she asked about a book on the library shelf, he answered. When she mentioned a classical piece she loved, he played it, quietly, almost shyly. Something had been planted, not love, not desire, respect. And in a house once ruled only by silence and structure, respect was the first step toward something real. The fragile peace didn't last. Storms never send warnings. One morning, as Aria stepped into the living room, she found a large envelope neatly placed on the coffee table. No sender, no return address, just her name in handwritten ink, Aria Sullivan. She opened it. Inside were photographs, clear, sharp. Ethan at an upscale downtown restaurant, seated across from Celeste Grant. They were smiling, glasses raised. Ethan looked calm. Celeste looked pleased. The timestamp said it all. 1 week ago. Aria felt something drop in her chest, cold and heavy. She didn't ask. She didn't confront him. She just retreated. She stayed in her room the entire day, claiming a headache. That night, Ethan knocked softly and asked, "You okay?" She replied, "Just need some rest." She didn't ask why. Maybe she was afraid of the answer. Maybe a part of her still believed he was like every other man, carving trust with a hidden blade. Ethan, meanwhile, had no clue what had happened. He was too deep in another crisis. Rowe investors were pulling out after Celeste, his ex, and a powerful investor, had distributed edited audio clips from their dinner, implying he was planning to rejoin forces with her. In truth, Ethan had turned her down flat. But he had no idea she had recorded their conversation or manipulated it for her gain. He buried himself in damage control, crisis meetings, PR triage, and all but disappeared from the house for days. Aria, left alone in a whirlwind of her own doubts, came to believe the worst. "I'm a fool," she whispered to herself one evening, sitting in the garden, eyes rimmed with red. "I should have known. No one means what they say in this game." 3 days later, at a quiet coffee shop near her old neighborhood, Aria overheard 2 Rowe employees speaking at the next table. They were whispering, but she heard enough. If the funds don't land by Friday, they're laying off hundreds. Word is, Rowe's mortgaged his own properties to keep it afloat. And that thing with the ex? total setup, but it spread like wildfire. Aria froze. That night, she went home and unlocked her private financial records, a trust her mother had left behind. Victoria never knew it existed. A substantial amount. Enough to save Rowe. The next morning, Aria walked into her lawyer's office and made the transfer. Every cent, sent anonymously through a shielded account. She signed simply as A. Sullivan. She didn't want Ethan to know. She didn't need a thank you. She did it because, despite everything, she still loved him. But fate wasn't about to wait for clarity. That same afternoon, on her way back from delivering supplies to a homeless shelter, Aria's car was struck broadside by a speeding truck. The driver fled. The crash was brutal. Aria was rushed to the ER in critical condition. Ethan got the call mid-meeting. He didn't speak, just stood, pale, then bolted from the room like the air had been ripped from his lungs. When he reached the hospital and saw her, bruised, bandaged, barely breathing, something inside him shattered. He sat by her side, holding her hand like it was his only anchor to the world. "Please," he whispered, "don't leave me." Hospitals have a way of making time feel endless. Ethan hadn't left Aria's side in 3 days. He hadn't slept. His usual gray blazer was wrinkled now. His face was drawn, eyes swollen from lack of rest. He told everyone, no meetings, no calls, no visitors unless absolutely necessary. There was no world outside. Only her and him. Every day, he held her hand and whispered things he'd never had the courage to say when she was awake. "I'm sorry for making you feel unimportant. I'm sorry I didn't protect you when I should have. You deserve to know everything." Still, Aria didn't wake, and so Ethan turned to the financial records, still haunted by the mystery of how Rowe had been saved, right when everything was falling apart. Buried in the documents, he found it, A. Sullivan, and beneath it a handwritten note to the bank. "Please keep this anonymous. He must not know it's from me. He owes me nothing." Ethan dropped to his knees on the floor. The truth hit harder than any betrayal. She saved him when he didn't even believe she cared. She had saved him, quietly, selflessly, without asking for recognition, without seeking gratitude, without demanding love in return. It wasn't kindness. It was unconditional love. "You really loved me," he whispered, his hand gently brushing her hair, "and I was too blind to see it." On the 4th day, the doctor reported subtle signs, a steadier heartbeat, a twitch of her fingers. And on the 5th morning, Aria opened her eyes. She didn't speak at first, just blinked, looked around, then stopped at the face she knew, tired, worn, but still there, still holding her hand. "You stayed," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan said, eyes brimming. "I'm right here, for as long as it takes." She wanted to ask so many things, but they all faded beneath the look in his eyes, a look that spoke of mistakes made, silence held too long, and a man willing to stay and make things right. A few days later, when Aria could speak clearly, Ethan told her everything, about Celeste, the crisis, the reason he'd disappeared, and how he'd found out who saved his company. "I should have said it all sooner," he admitted, "but I swear, I'm done running." Aria was quiet. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand. "I thought I was being used," she said. "I shut myself down right when I should have opened up." Ethan shook his head. "You've lived in a world that taught you to expect pain. I understand why you closed the door, but even then, you chose to save me." Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy, it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence shared by two people learning to stay not with promises, but with presence. Senile Aria had woken up. Nothing returned to normal, but maybe that was the best thing that could have happened. Ethan didn't try to fill the silence with apologies. He didn't bring flowers or gifts or throw hollow promises at her feet. He just showed up every day. He took her to physical therapy, sat through endless test results, learned how to brew her favorite tea, rearranged his schedule just so he could join her in the garden every afternoon. No one mentioned the word contract. No one counted the days on the 3-month timeline. The roles were gone. The masks had fallen. What remained were two people slowly stepping into something real, something gentle, but something more fragile than either of them expected. Aria didn't rush to forgive, but she wasn't guarded anymore. She watched him in the quiet moments, far from spotlights or scrutiny, when he helped the gardener pull weeds, when he gently adjusted her pillows, or when he chuckled softly at a news article while sitting by her hospital bed. She began to believe he truly was changing, not for her, but because he wanted to. One night, she sat in the library, curled into a chair beside the fireplace. Ethan walked in, holding a notebook. "I wrote a few things," he said, placing it on the table in front of her. She opened it, not love letters, not poetry, just scattered thoughts, honest reflections from the past few days. "I used to think control was the only way to survive. Aria isn't the storm. She's the mirror to the chaos I've tried to hide. She taught me that staying, even when it's hard, is a form of love." Aria turned each page, read every line. She didn't say a word, until she finally looked up. Her eyes no longer questioned, they simply trusted. "I thought you weren't paying attention," she said quietly. "I just didn't know how to show it." After that night, everything shifted. Ethan began inviting her into Rowe, not as an accessory, but as a voice he valued. Aria, in turn, dusted off an old proposal she'd once hidden away, a plan to convert abandoned buildings into support centers for women recovering from abuse. "You should present this to the board," Ethan said as he read the draft. "You really think they'll listen to me?" She smiled. "I'm not exactly their type." "You have what they don't," he replied, "lived experience." And he was right. That presentation became a turning point. She didn't just get them to listen, she made them believe. That evening, after all the guests had left Rowe Tower, Aria stood quietly by the window, watching the city lights shimmer below. Ethan approached, 2 cups in hand. "For the woman who silenced a roomful of finance executives," he said, handing her a cup. She laughed, eyes brighter than the skyline. "We've come a long way," she whispered. "We have," Ethan nodded, "and we're still going." 6 months had passed since the accident. Everything seemed to settle into a new chapter. Not rushed, not dramatic, just calm. The kind of calm Aria and Ethan had both spent a lifetime trying to find. Aria was no longer a contract wife. She had become a real part of Ethan's world, not by title, but by presence. She still lived in Rowe Estate, but her room was no longer a separate space. They shared a kitchen, a desk, an evening routine, sometimes just sitting together in silence, reading or sharing fragments of old memories. And Ethan, once a man of control and isolation, now knew how to ask, "Are you tired?" He made warm milk when she had headaches, held her hand quietly at crowded parties without needing anyone else to understand. One evening, after a successful fundraising event for Aria's women's shelter, where she had stood and spoken like a leader, Ethan invited her to the rooftop of a historic hotel downtown. No setup, no flowers, no diamond ring, just a blanket, 2 cups of hot cocoa, and the wind whispering between skyscrapers. Aria pulled her coat tighter. "You dragged me up here for what exactly?" Ethan looked at her, his eyes steady, soft. "No speech," he said. "Just one question." She fell silent. Her heart beat faster, but her gaze held firm. "I once chose you because of a contract," he said quietly. "Then I chose you in the storm. I chose to stay when it would have been easier to walk away." He paused, looked into her eyes. "Now I want to choose you, freely, with no terms, no limits, no end." From his pocket, Ethan pulled out a simple silver ring. No gemstone, no brand, just a clean circle, understated and honest. Like the way he was looking at her now. Aria Sullivan, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Will you choose to stay with me, not because of a contract, but because of you? Aria looked at the ring, then at him, and smiled, the kind of smile he had never seen before on her. She stared at the ring. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them, like the breath before a yes. I don't need a perfect promise, she whispered. Just someone willing to stay, every day. She held out her hand, and Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from everything he finally felt. In that moment, with the city lights blinking beneath them and the quiet between them saying more than words ever could, neither of them spoke again, because everything that needed to be said was already in the choice they had made. The following spring, the garden behind Rowe estate began to bloom. Aria knelt in the soil, gently planting the first row of sunflowers near the porch. The ground was still damp, the wind still cool, but sunlight had finally returned after a long winter. Ethan stood on the porch, holding 2 mugs of coffee. You sure you don't want gloves? He asked. I'm sure, Aria replied, wiping sweat from her brow with a dirt-streaked hand. I want to feel the earth, for real. You teach me that every day, he said softly, setting the coffee beside her. Teach you what? How to live without hiding. Aria smiled, then looked down at the flower bed. When I was little, I thought sunflowers bloomed only once, but they don't. If you care for them right, they bloom again, every year. Ethan sat beside her in silence, and together they pressed earth over the seeds. No new rings, no grand vows. They had hurt each other, grown distant, lost each other once in contracts and storms, but they had chosen to stay. And every day, with the softness of morning light, with the simplicity of presence, they chose each other again. Love, it turned out, wasn't something you say once in a lifetime. It was a choice, repeated, every day. And every morning as the sun touched the garden, they chose again,